Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Christina Höppner toku inua. I'm a member of the Flexible Learning Association of New Zealand's Executive Committee, and I'm very happy to welcome you to today's part 2 of the panel conversation, Artificial Intelligence is Here to Stay, and its impact on online, flexible, distance, and also open learning. And let me start with a karakia. Aia te mataranga kia marama, kia whai takena mahi katoa, tū maya, tū kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tato ia tato katoa. Today, we'll have our wonderful panelists back, and we'll also added a couple of other panelists for you. Who can talk to us about artificial intelligence in their particular sector. And so I'm very pleased to be offering this webinar for all of you together as FLANZ, as an executive member from the Flexible Learning Association of New Zealand, in cooperation with EdTech NZ, with whom we are partnering in order to bring this event to you. And our panelists today are Ivo Leota Tupoi, who is an executive council member for EdTech New Zealand and the director of Pacific Kids Learning, Dr. Rebecca Moroney, a lecturer Learning Sciences and Development for the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning at the University of South Australia, Stuart Wakefield, who is the Chief Digital Officer for the New Zealand Ministry of Education, and Dr. Truman Pham, who is Postgraduate Director at Academy EX, and also on the Executive Council for EdTech New Zealand. So what we have planned for you today is that we have a conversation. Last time we started with statements from each panelist, but today we thought we'll make sure that you have enough time to ask all of your questions from our panelists. And if we have our 5th panelist come in as well, then we will make sure to add him as well so that we have the university represented too. And I don't even need to start with one of the questions that I had prepared in case there was not a question in the chat, because we do already have our first question. Thank you so much for that. And so let me read that out so that our panelists can decide who would like to start taking that question. And we were thinking that not everybody has to take every single question that comes through, but the ones that they would like to answer, so that we also can make sure that we get through all of your questions, or the majority of them, depending on how many questions there are, and then therefore have a very rich conversation with all of you. And if you'd, as I said, like to also ask your question through the microphone, please feel free to raise your hand so that we can have you on screen as well. But let's get to our first question. Kia ora, from Melissa. What would you personally like to see included in legislation around artificial intelligence to protect Indigenous knowledge and self-determination? Alternatively, what would you like to see in terms of informal guidelines for the education industry using artificial intelligence in a bicultural nation? And that, of course, goes directly to the heart of our conversation that we are having today. So the floor is open for all of our panelists in Aotearoa and also over in Australia.
Awesome. So I'll jump in. Melissa, thanks for the question. Yeah, that's something that's in our conversations at the moment in the work that we do. There hasn't been a lot of kind of community engagement around AI at the moment in our Pacific communities, and this is purely from my experience in the in the space that we work in with the focus on Pacific learners. So I guess to answer your question, really, around whatever's been developed in LLMs or large language model data sets should really kind of include an algorithm that has full participation of our Pacific communities, informed consent around data sovereignty. So legislation should really kind of have that required information from or the consent from Indigenous communities regarding the use of and collection of data. For example, what's happening in ChatGPT at the moment, there's a lot of obviously there's a lot of work to be improved in that area, in the way that it's being developed, and the data that it's kind of drawing from is not accurate, and it's a major concern for us with our indigenous knowledge and how we incorporate these into the AI systems. So data sovereignty, really getting the participation and collaboration of those in the Indigenous communities, and making, I guess, including them in the decision-making processes around the AI development for implementation in education. So that's kind of some initial thinking around what I've seen on the ground. Again, saying also that one of the reasons why we focus in our Pacific communities is because we are kind of like already behind with technology, and the development of our programs really try to boost the levels of engagement for our young learners so they don't fall behind. But getting the buy-in from the wider community is really important, and is actually one of my concerns at the moment, because we're not having that kind of robust or proactive discussion at the moment in the Pacific communities. So again, just, community collaboration. I can't emphasize that enough, getting our experts on board in terms of developing the algorithms for any kind of large language model development in AI.
Kia ora, Ivo. Stuart, do you want to chime in? Because recently the ministry did provide some tips, advice, guidelines on the use of generative AI in particular.
Yeah, kia ora, Christina, happy to talk to that. Just actually to Melissa's first question, one of the things possibly to think about there is the protections that already exist in existing legislation that is quite broad and not necessarily specific to generative AI. So thinking here around issues of intellectual property ownership and copyright and those questions, a lot of these tools are built on a business model where they're not paying for access to content. And that's something that'll be interesting to see how that plays out internationally as well. We're obviously not the only jurisdiction facing this challenge. So watching with interest what's playing out in the EU and the US in this space. So I think there's some general protection there. So my only other comment there, I guess, is developing legislation is quite a time-consuming process. Not say we shouldn't go there or may need to go there, but also we're talking about fast-moving technology. So anchoring that in core principles and ethics, I think, will be really fundamentally important. To the second part of Melissa's question, actually, I might just drop a link into the chat. So for those of you that aren't aware, we published, I guess, what I would describe as sort of very initial early guidance on the use of generative AI, primarily focused in compulsory schooling for schools in kura. I'd summarize that as sort of proceed with caution at this point, and being cognizant of a lot of those dimensions. So I might drop that quickly in the chat now, and that might lead to some more specific follow-ups.
Rebecca, you've been working with AI for quite a while, not so much generative AI as far as I understand it, because right now, of course, we are talking a lot about ChatGPT and the like, but of course, artificial intelligence has a much, much bigger impact and did not just start in November of 2022. So you're working in an institute, in a department that has been looking at how to harness and use artificial intelligence for education. Do you also have the connection there maybe of what is happening in the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander space in Australia?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Christina. So I think we're actually, what's coming to mind as we've been chatting is I do think we're at a really unique opportunity to have voices involved. If we think back to, you know, when social media came on the scene, there were certain voices dictating those conversations, and now we have a lot of issues. Whereas I think with something like AI, hopefully we've learnt from our mistakes and we are involving multiple voices. And I think that's extremely important because, you know, as Ivo said, the large language models at the moment, they do have a lot of bias in them. The data sets have been created by certain individuals, you know, and if we just use them as they are, they will continue to, you know, dominant cultures will continue. And so that is really concerning. So I think there's two things we can do. One is making sure we have a variety of voices involved in the conversation, and then two, teaching users to be critical consumers of it. So not something that we use all the time, but being aware that there are biases and making sure that we, you know, understand what's involved in that. To the legislation point, I actually think it's a good thing that something hasn't been pushed out and implemented extremely quickly, because I think that would then have major issues and concerns. So what I'm seeing here is people taking time. So for example, our university institution, we've put the onus back on course coordinators to determine if you think AI should or should not be used in your assignment. Our program directors have given us the opportunity to change our assessment pieces, which that does take a lot of time, but I have seen it used where there's a traffic light system. So red means as a student, you cannot use it in this assignment. Yellow is proceed with caution. Green is go all out and show us how and where you've used it. And so that has been, I guess, an interesting approach because it's putting it back on people. But I think it's good that it's taking time to have, like, for the legislation to come through, because I think it's crucial to have multiple voices in those conversations, I guess, to summarize my point there.
That's kind of quite the tension between having a concerted effort so that not everybody is cooking up their own thing, versus at the same time, though, having the freedom to explore, freedom to see how the different organizations, or maybe even individual departments within a university or the within even a school, can make use of it, and therefore use the tools for the benefits, but also point out where there might be issues. Especially around the use of certain tools and looking at privacy, and also protecting students that their data doesn't suddenly end up in the systems. Ivo put, and I'd like to read that out to you because the chat, of course, is very difficult to have available in a recording. So I want to make sure that we capture her further response to Melissa's initial question also in the recording. And so Ivo says, in my opinion, informal guidelines for the education industry should emphasize the importance of developing and utilizing AI tools and content that are culturally appropriate and sensitive to the Indigenous context. I think that is really, really important. And Melissa says that she has been experimenting with ChatGPT, and it is dire in terms of answering questions about Kaupapa Māori and not suitable for her context at the moment. Do any of your panelists have you been involved in some of those conversations? Because, of course, everybody is using that huge data set that was accumulated by scraping the internet, and as Stuart had pointed out, without any view of where the data was taken from, whether it was copyrighted, or in the Māori context or other Indigenous contexts, whether people were actually allowed to just take that content without permission. Have you been involved with groups that want to look into that might also be creating their own data sets in order to respect the data, respect the knowledge, respect the kaupapa, and also any other traditions that might be very, very important to take into consideration? Rebecca and Ivo, you're both nodding.
I'm happy to jump in there quickly. So I think one of the massive things of AI seemingly landing in our lap is that it has removed a lot of the barriers that once impeded somebody like me who has an educational psychology background from creating my own AI algorithms, my own AI applications. And so the way that we're using it is to make our own. So we're leveraging, or I guess we're outsourcing some of those data science skills. I don't know how to code. I don't know how to do those things, but I do know what an AI application should look like to support my students. And so all I'm using it for is as a tool to help me create something that can be used in my specific context for my students and for my learners. And so I'm not using it directly, I'm using it as a way to leverage my own knowledge. And so I think that that's one of the benefits that it has unlocked, and one of the ways that we can make it specific to the problem, the community, the ideas, whatever we need to create it for.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like there are some ongoing conversations in the Māori space for Indigenous languages. I know I haven't met him personally, but Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru, who's been leading conversation on LinkedIn around ChatGPT, you know, on the risks and benefits to Indigenous languages, something that's not really kind of widely discussed in the Pacific space at the moment, which is a concern from a learner's point of view. I guess one thing that comes to mind is, again, I've seen the Ministry of Education digital strategy guide come out for the Connected Ako, just released recently. I guess the question is, how do we drive our own, like we all work in our own separate spaces in the work we do for education, but how do we drive a connected strategy that helps us embed the AI learning into our, you know, for our kids' learning, whether it be around language data sets, you know, cultural identity in terms of the information that's being fed through LLM, the algorithms. I guess it's all to do with equitable opportunities that AI can provide. So just putting the question back, I guess, back to the panel and to the audience as well, is how can we drive collectively, I guess, in a more, we're all having our separate conversations in separate spaces. I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do we bring it all together so that we can roll just as fast as, you know, AI is just moving at such a rapid pace. We barely can keep up with it. So how can we strategize to implement AI in the kids' learning? You know, I haven't fully read the digital strategy at the moment that MOE just released, but I'll be interested to see where we can plug in for our Pacific learners in that regard. And I'll quickly just add South Korea. I've been exploring opportunities and what's been happening in the North Asian region, and there's been a lot of kind of government, really, I think what is seen to be really effective data and digital strategies that implement AI learning. For example, some of the things that's been implemented in the South Korean Ministry of Education is how to connect, you know, every pupil with digital tools to, you know, to their customized learning to better study maths, English, so that they're well placed, and kind of embedding AI into those subjects. And yeah, apologies if I sound so vague, but it's just something that I'm currently exploring around the Indigenous. How do we keep up to speed with what's happening with AI without kind of falling behind? How do we bring our communities into the conversation instead of having these separate conversations in our small kind of pockets of, you know, little groups, both online and in person?
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I'd like to answer the question from Evo and also the question from Melissa. So I think we should avoid the chicken and egg situation, because if we would like to develop a big data set for indigenous culture, and then we need to have some regulations about data protection, just like what the EU has already done with general data protection regulations. And also, and that's why we need to have only more conversations between at all level and between different communities about how AI actually works, so we understand how bias can happen, and then people can be more confident to talk about how they can use AI when they understand actually how AI works. So at the moment, I can see that many conversation is more about what we see at the outcome of ChatGPT, right? But how actually it works, not much conversation about that. And that's why somebody already mentioned about AI literacies, and whether AI literacy can be considered as digital literacy. In my opinion, they should be different, because you can see AI develop very fast, and more it will be used in on every areas of our life. So that's why we government should take steps to develop regulations, and where communities and everybody should need to understand more about how AI works, and have more conversations about how we can use AI, and also how we can protect data when we use AIs. And in education, before I finish, I would like to say that we should always put the learner at the center of every technology we use. At the end of the day, technology is just a supporting tool. Technology won't be able to replace teacher. Technology won't be able to replace pedagogy. Right? So if we have that clear views, and then we can be more confident to work forward with AI and any other technology.
Thank you, Truman. And you brought up the good question. Should there be an AI literacy, or should it be subsumed into all the other literacies that we have, like digital literacy, information literacy, cultural literacy, and of course, the other literacies, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so you're a proponent of having it sitting there separately. Do the other panelists agree with that, or do you have a different viewpoint? I saw Rebecca nodding. So we have another one who says, yes, we need a separate AI literacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big issues is that people don't understand AI capabilities. As Truman just said, we tend to deal with the output, and we think, because we hear big terms, deep learning, reinforcement learning, neural networks, black box, those are terrifying terms. When you break them down, you address a lot of the myths and misconceptions, and you can actually start to see what AI is capable of now, what it's likely to be capable of in the short, medium, and long-term future. And having that knowledge is empowering. So I think absolutely, and I don't necessarily think it's around how do you create an algorithm yourself, but what are the things that go into creating an algorithm? Because when you break it down, it is demystifying, and it's not as complicated as we kind of think it is when we first look at it.
Thank you.
I'll have to agree with that. Also with Truman's sentiments, I think there's a lot of discussion around, yes, ethics and everything else is important, but understanding how these language models work will be, how can we implement the understanding of creating these AI programs to embed in the kids' learning, because I think that's important. That's the future of jobs at the moment, is building these AI models and ensuring that. So I've just kind of added some comments there just in support, in extension of Truman's comments around some of the stuff that we do. And we've pivoted, and also our programs that we run on the ground here at grassroots level. For example, from a professional point of view, we are currently, in the creative industry, which is an industry that we work in, where we also work in the edtech space, is that there are ethics also in the creative output. Like, obviously with, and I've just gone blank, the image generating software that AI have.
Midjourney.
Midjourney. I was just using it a couple of nights ago too, you know, just to test out a few of the prompts that kind of gets generated. You know, there's a lot of ethics around that, but there's also good ethics around it. In terms of Adobe is one company or organization that's really kind of fast tracking their ethical use of AI in creative industries. So it's building a different business model. But what we do in the work, in the space that we do, how do we as an organization stay informed and making sure that we're at the top of our game, and how do we bring our communities along with us to make sure that what we know is rolled out at foundation level? A prime example is our Young Pacifica animators workshops, where we teach kids the basics of animation and we introduce them to technologies. Now I'm kind of thinking and redesigning the program to suit, okay, how can we provide the critical thinking space in terms of, okay, how do we change it up to apply some of the AI knowledge that we have, is some of the things that I'm thinking of at the moment. So I agree with Truman's and Rebecca's sentiments. I think sometimes the shift also needs to be in how we create these spaces for our kids to contribute.
Ivo, have you then already talked with your kids about artificial intelligence, what they're maybe already using on their phones themselves, or how they might want to use it, what if they have any concerns, or if they are just using it without reading the data privacy pages, which are 5 pages long or longer?
It's funny. I actually asked them a couple of months ago. They've never heard of AI, which is great, but I'm starting to teach them about it. They are becoming more aware of it, and I'm actually kind of developing my own program to test out on them to see how I can roll it out on the work that we do. They're really curious. They go, wow, what is that? You know, what does that mean? So they have really no idea unless they're informed by either their parents or teachers. On the ground, teachers aren't having it's not even considered as part of any type of curriculum at the moment in schools. Obviously, teachers are exploring it at the moment, and they're to enhance their working capabilities, making sure, you know, that they have better workflows. Exactly the same as what we're doing in our creative industries. You know, we're finding ways to enhance our workflows to better manage our time. So that's the benefits of AI from an industry point of view. So I guess applying that same knowledge, I don't want my kids to miss out. So I kind of share, you know, that space for them from a kid's point of view, and looking for tools that can get them to start exploring and start creating, and start to understand how things are changing.
Truman, what does that look like in your space in tertiary education? Have you already had those conversations with your students? Do you see that they are creating assignments where everything just runs through ChatGPT, or where are you at?
Yes, at Academy ES, we have colloquials at every school holiday when in the program and teaching. So we raised a lot of questions and have conversation with our students who are teachers in New Zealand. So yep, we talk about data privacy, data sovereignty, and how can use AI to support the learning, make sure the actual learning happen. So that is something we need to keep talking. And I agree with a comment from Marie about whether we should have a centralized space for the best practice in education when using AI. So at the moment, everyone is trying. Trial and error happen everywhere, right? But we need to have some conversation about our experience with AI and how we can make it improve the learning. Of course, the question of academic integrity is always happen, you know. So, and as I said before, every technology have its own strength and limitations. So it's up to us to understand that technology and use them to support the learning. Make sure the learner is at the center.
Stuart, that last question from Marie, is there a centralized space where we can access all the resources on the development of generative AI in New Zealand? So for example, regulations, best practice, and so on. Since your team at the Ministry of Education is watching this space very closely and has published tips, advice, guidelines, now also with the Connected ACO resources that are out, you're doing a lot in that space, and therefore I assume you have a lot of links collected somewhere. Is the ministry planning on making some of those resources more publicly available, or have I just not seen them yet?
No, you've probably seen the things that we have published. I think with respect to that question, that's quite broad around generative AI across all of Aotearoa. I think certainly with respect to the application into the education system, then yes, you can expect us to continue to publish on that point. I think there are other parts of public sector that will pick up that mahi more broadly around GCDO at Internal Affairs, for example, are doing some work around government-wide policy in this space at the moment. So we'll certainly look at how we integrate in there. There's lots in the previous discussion that would be great to just pick up and respond to briefly. I think, Eva, your points around things like ethics and societal impact, I mean, these are not new challenges that are unique to AI. I think we've seen lots of technology create those challenges for us. So what I find really exciting though is the widespread and fairly sudden availability of generative AI apps and tools makes this really, really real in the curriculum. So, you know, what better way to teach ethics than some of the fantastic capabilities that some of these new tools have that makes it very real for students. It's a lot more accessible than trying to teach something in the abstract. So I don't pretend to be a curriculum design expert, but you know, I'm finding myself agreeing with all of your sentiments there that this will become a core part of digital literacy going forward. Knowing about the capabilities of the tools and the risks and opportunities that come with them, and it's an exciting space to be involved in. Eva touched on Connected ACO. I think thank you, Christina, for putting the link in the chat. And that's not going to give you the answer to that question, but I guess what it will provide is a framework for how we think about the introduction and use of any new technology. And it's great that this has happened about the time that generative AI has become much more widespread and available. And I do want to pick up on one further point you made, Eva, which was, I guess, the question around equity and how that plays out in this space. So, you know, a lot of the korero on this to date has been focused on the public versions of tools that are more or less free or without a direct charge, but we're already starting to see the development of paid for versions with additional features and premium capabilities. So there are lots of dimensions to equity. We touched on things like bias and the tools themselves, but actually the much more fundamental problem, I suspect, will become these tools potentially become the new frontier in the digital divide, and something we need to be thinking about that, you know, as they're used in some of the use cases, Rebecca, you were talking about with the traffic light system, you know, if there are differing capabilities between students that can afford a premium tool versus access to a free tool, I think that's something we need to think through how we deal with that. I don't pretend to have the answers to it, but can see that as the sort of looming problem. At the moment, it's all free because we are in effect training these models. We are part of the product, but yeah, that will change, as we've seen with many other technologies.
Stuart, since you mentioned we are part of the product and we contribute to the now ever evolving data set. So for example, when you type anything into the web interface for ChatGPT, that can be used by OpenAI. Yes. And therefore, in other conversations that I've been part of, educators were very reluctant and students were also very reluctant. And that, of course, was more on the in the university sector, that they said, please do not put anything through ChatGPT, or of course also plagiarism tools come up quite extensively. So what are those conversations? And there I'm focusing a bit on Ivo and our tertiary educators here. Do you have those conversations with the students so that they are aware of what is actually happening when they put their name in, or when they do a search, or when they have a question answered, or if an instructor, a lecturer puts a student work through it, are they aware of that they should get consent for that?
I would hope so, but I would think I would hazard a guess that the answer is probably not. In one of my courses earlier this semester, some students were talking about how Snapchat has a My AI feature as a friend. And so this course was just on digital citizenship. And so we changed the whole course, the whole lesson, because nobody knew anything other than that it was there. And so we then spent quite a while trying to find Snapchat's policies. When I went on their website, they were saying, this is boring lawyer talk. You don't want to read this. Here's some fun features. And so it started bringing some alarm bells. It took me several days to actually get to find the policy. And there were some concerns with it because it had immediately assumed that I had provided location preferences. I had never done that and I couldn't turn it off. So I had to go through this whole process and the students had no idea. And these are pre-service teachers. So they're about to go into classrooms and they themselves had no idea. So I think it's really on those that have that information to share it as loudly and publicly as you possibly can, to say, and to put pressure. You know, it shouldn't have taken me 2 to 3 days to find Snapchat's policies and how I could reverse it for myself, let alone for, you know, young people who are using the features and so forth. So I think the onus is on us, that if you have that information, to make sure that, one, you use it in a safe and ethical way, but that you're sharing that. So anybody that I, you know, come into contact with about this and have conversations about this, and just being mindful of, you know, don't put people's names in, don't put personally identifiable information. And I think going back to the idea around AI literacy, I think that's a big part of developing AI literacy. Yeah.
There, Jackie has a wonderful follow-up question and comment. She's wondering who in higher education institutions, but probably also applies to a degree, I would say, for schools, should be taking responsibility of socializing ethics, policy of use of generative AI tools with students and staff. Could it be the library and learning centers as a starting point? Have you already had conversations like that at your institutions? And then, Stuart, of course, where do you see from the ministry perspective where the responsibility lies? Who should make sure that people are AI literate, both on the student and staff side of things?
That'd probably be a good question for Rebecca. Sorry.
I haven't seen in our own institution, I haven't seen the library. They put out a module about generative AI, but it was how to use it. At our institution, we have schools. So each school, the dean of the school. So for example, in education, they've taken a different stance to in STEM. So at the moment it is at the school level, and then I guess we're waiting for a university-wide policy to come behind. We have been told to use it, basically, but to use it wisely, smartly, to educate our students about it. So in terms of taking responsibility for those students who I've found who have overused it, we've given them really strong warnings to say that it's a breach of academic integrity, but we do not currently have a policy in place where if they were to have plagiarized from another website, we have academic integrity policies. So we don't actually have that, and I'm not sure if we will have one. It'll, in obvious situations, you know, like an exam, you won't be able to use it and so forth. But I think we're just trying to teach people to be safe users of it. For those students that were going to cheat, they were always going to cheat. And it's going to be obvious to catch them. They're still going to be the student that submits an hour before and so forth. Whereas everybody else, we're saying, okay, it's here, you should use it. I mean, I use it every day to make my writing better, to help me with tasks and so forth. So it's not about taking it away from them or having a policy in place that bans it, rather supports. I don't know where that will come from long term, but at the moment we're just seeing it at our individual school level.
Can I add something to what Rebecca says? Yeah, I think what we usually say in our sections with our students is that in education, context is everything. So you can see that different schools have different way of teaching different knowledge. So the way they use AI tools will be quite different. So we need, so for AI, we need to really consider the context of how we use the tool. That's why a library or a learning center alone won't be able to develop a policy for the whole university or for the whole institutions. So I just like the question about the regulation from the government for data protection, right? For the whole society. It's the same for a university or an institution where everyone need to contribute their part into the policy, and everyone need to contribute their context into the policy. Otherwise, the policy won't work for them. So that's why it's just come back to what Evo said before. These are society-wide conversations at different levels.
And so, Auriel, oh, sorry, Stuart, go ahead.
I was just picking up on your question, extending this to schools in Kura. So I mean, we haven't quite deliberately, we haven't taken a regulatory response to this. And that's why when you look at the link that you sent through earlier, that really talks about advice and guidance. So that, you know, as most of you will know on this webinar, we run a very devolved system here in Aotearoa. My comments here generally, I guess, would be, I think this isn't any one part of a school or kura. I'd encourage schools to be thinking about this as a conversation with boards of trustees around questions of risk and ethics and how that happens right through to teaching staff and students themselves. So, I mean, there may come a point at which you cross a threshold where regulation or legislation is required, whether that's education specific or a more general response. I think, you know, we've seen some precedent for that in other technologies like the Harmful Digital Communications Act, where things like internet harms have reached the point where that type of response is required. I think to Rebecca's earlier comments on it, you know, this is evolving so quickly, I don't think we're at that point yet. It would be premature.
Yeah, and so Auriel's question comes to that. Do you think there will actually ever be a policy to keep pace with artificial intelligence, especially when it is connected to the other AI, academic integrity? Because the field, at least at the moment, is just evolving so quickly.
A flip side of that perhaps is the use of AI to write policy in the first place, which is a trend I'm seeing in some parts of the public sector, but not without its own risks. But I think ultimately that comes down to not making policy or legislation too technology specific. And if you anchor it in some of the really important principles that the panelists were talking about at the start, around respect for Indigenous knowledge and IP and ethics and those things, I think, you know, within reason that can generally survive evolution of technology. We saw some of that as an example in the Privacy Act, which we've been through another refinement, but it was 20 odd years between those two pieces of legislation. So, but whether the exponential rate of change here will give us that luxury of time, who knows?
Yeah, and so intro touches on that then as well. Should staff developers and librarian advisors be playing a major role in this kind of, yeah, the evolving laws, guidelines, and advice around academic integrity and AI? So it's been 6 weeks since our first webinar, our first panel, and as we've mentioned at least a couple of times, artificial intelligence is evolving rather rapidly. And Ivo mentioned that she has started writing her own programs, exploring that with students. Rebecca, of course, has been working in that space for a long time. Truman as well in a different area, and the team at the ministry that Stuart is representing today has published advice during that time, and now also the Connected ACO resources. So if you look back at those, if we are just taking that 6-week time frame alone, so mid-May to about now, how has your opinion on the use of AI evolved? Or has it not? are you still at the opinions where you were at that time, or has there been a major shift already for you?
If I can add in here, from my point of view, in the last 6 months or the last few months, yeah, the removal of fear is important in terms of how we approach AI, because it is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And yeah, so guidelines is really important in terms of, I always look at my own children, like how would I want them to develop in their learning? I still want them to have that critical thinking, you know, that creative thinking space. How can AI enhance their learning journey? And how can they be part of it, of building the algorithms and data sets available to industry? So yeah, I think I get excited about the advancement of it as fast as it is. Yeah, I guess the only concern is how slow our Pacific communities are moving towards it. That's my main concern in terms of around the ethics. Like, we could talk ethics all we like, but if we're not taking part in conversation and making things happen, and then it'll obviously be detrimental to the progress in our own communities. So that's just some feedback from the last few months.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I feel a little bit more optimistic, because I can see that people talk more about both the strength and limitation of the AI now, rather than just one side of that, and also more about how AI works. So I think that's a good, and everything going in a good direction. However, the lesson we learned from digital transformation is that somebody is still left behind. We still have digital gap. So that's why we still need to work hard to make sure, just like Evo said, bring everyone, every community into the conversations about AI. And when we have conversation, we can raise the awareness. And then when we can raise the awareness, and then we can use, everyone can use AI in a good way and not harmful way. So that's why I'm a little bit more optimistic.
I'm conscious I wasn't part of the previous panel, but if I reflect on that sort of time period, I guess two things. I think it's called Amara's law, but it's the adage around we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short term, but underestimate its impact in the long term. And I think that's very true of what we're seeing play out here. The other cause for optimism to me is I had never appreciated that we had such a massive supply of experts in AI until I went to LinkedIn. So fantastic that we have so much expertise there. But yeah, cutting through, I guess we saw the initial announcements very much on the upside and the opportunity. It's good to see the conversation a bit more balanced on some of the risks and challenges as well. But I think we also shouldn't lose sight of the potential of this capability as well, particularly in education. The opportunities that this might afford, if done safely with attention to all of the issues that the panel's talked about, I think are massive and have a lot of potential. So I don't want to just focus on the negative risk side on this.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add that I guess the way that I'm personally responding over the last short little while is that the more you use it, the better you get at it, and the more you can make it work for you. So, we've got all these amazing tools, and people will go through, and then I hear it time and time again, everybody still logs in, and the first question they ask ChatGPT is, how do I lose weight? And so I think we're looking for a magic pill, like a diet pill or something like that again. And I think it's about sustained use. And when you have that kind of exposure and experience, then you can start to make it work for you. And so personally, I'm seeing that in my own life, but I'm starting to see people move beyond just those initial help me write an email and so forth, and having the systems solve some problems, like real problems they have in their work or in their life.
Right, 2 months on, the weight loss tips don't work. Just anyway.
It just needs the proper diet plan provided by ChatGPT there. There was one question that I had overlooked in the chat earlier, so apologies. So that will be pretty much our last question before we are wrapping up. And that is a question by DN. And it says, GPTs will provide best of internet answers, which we can all already criticize. Traditional materials provided to beginners limited the range of answers or expected knowledge, e.g. a basic approach, which reduces cognitive load. When the AI tools jump straight to advanced level answers, how do we help trainees cope in intro situations? To which then, Rebecca, you had already provided an answer. Do you want to take that question?
Sure. So one of the benefits is that you can ask ChatGPT or any other large language model to take on personas. So you could ask it to explain a concept to you in simpler terms. You could ask it, if it's still complex, you could say, explain it to me like I'm a 12-year-old, like I'm a 6-year-old. Give me an analogy. So it relates it to something that you're familiar with. So I've seen teachers use it to explain the Industrial Revolution and liken it to the smartphone. So it creates analogies, or you can ask, to take on a persona of Shakespeare or whoever it is. So if there's something that you're familiar with, then you can relate it to that kind of phenomenon, or you can just ask it to explain it in simpler terms. That can be quite beneficial when we're thinking about differentiating curriculums for students as well. You could ask, for a low, medium, high kind of explanation of a concept, and immediately your topic has been differentiated 3 ways. So that's how I would suggest, but I would suggest play around with it to see what type of understanding either you have or your students have, and then frame your prompt to help you there.
Thank you. And I think that is then an invitation to everybody who would like to explore those tools further to give that a go, and not just stop at the first prompt, but really dig deeper, go deeper into the questioning, refine the prompt, be that through in ChatGPT, or Ivo had mentioned Midjourney before, so whether you use any of the other AI tools, see what you can get out of it, and don't just stop at the first or the second answer, because it does learn and it does take the previous context into consideration. Therefore, it is getting better at responding and refining things. And of course, because I work quite a bit with portfolios, I've been looking at how we can use it for reflection, for student reflection, and there are also AI bots that help with that, so that we are not getting an answer, but the bot is actually asking us questions so that we can reflect further on it. And so one fantastic example that I just like to throw in is RiffBot, that is based out of Stanford University, and has been done through research, through academic research as well, in order to provide very good frameworks around the reflection already, so that teachers only actually need to put in their question and don't need to initially even define prompts very explicitly like with other tools, because it does take the science into consideration. So yeah, lots and lots of possibilities to play with. And so if you are okay with the terms and conditions and also privacy statements that the various tools have, it would be good to explore things further and have your opinion on what how you want to deal with that in your classes, or in whichever context you are, be that school, university, or also workplace learning, for example. So that brings us to the end now of our session. And I'd like to thank everybody, in particular our panelists, Ivo, Rebecca, Stuart, and Truman for their time today to answer all of the questions that had come through in the chat. Thank you so much to everybody who listened in and who also asked questions, provided comments. And then also just wanted to remind you that this was a webinar offered by EdTech New Zealand and Flexible Learning Association of New Zealand. And we are always looking for new members. So if you have not yet joined, please do consider it. There are different benefits for each institution, for each association. And we look forward to seeing you in a future event, be that online or in person. There are definitely possibilities there from both organizations in the future. So before we are all moving away onto our own pathways and get back to our everyday activities, I'd like to finish with a karakia. Kia whakaraya te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turoku, kia turoki whakataha ai, kia turoki whakataha ai, haumia huie tai kie.